a lot of iconic characters in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe. Characters that pop off the page, deliver in key moments, and pull at our heartstrings. However, not every character in JJK needs to do all three of those things. See, because sometimes when it comes down to it in action shonen, some characters can be defined as truly great just based on the fact that when they show up, fights start kicking. And with no character in JJK is that more true than with Mahoraga. See, Mahoraga, or, and I'm going to have to read this, 8-handled sword divergent Sylvan Divine General Mahoraga, is the most powerful Shikigami in the entire JJK universe. Considered to be the final boss of the Ten Shadows technique, a Shikigami so powerful that no Ten Shadows user who did actively have Sukuna living inside of them has ever been able to best it. A Shikigami that exists within a technique that has never been used by said technique, at least by those who were born with the technique. And yet, even though Mahoraga is an unruly, unconquerable Shikigami who we really don't see all that often, the fan base of JJK is absolutely rabid for it. Which is especially surprising when you consider the fact that Mahoraga has never won a fight it entered into, a trend that will most likely keep up in its newest appearance in Majulo, JJK's sequel. Why do people love Mahoraga so much? How do Mahoraga's abilities work? And maybe more importantly than anything, how has Mahoraga changed over the year? Well, I figured today, since Mahoraga has remade its appearance in Majulo, and Season 3 of JJK has now kicked off, that there's never been a better time to dive into one of the JJK fandom's favorite character. So sit down and buckle up, because today we're talking the Obstapa Mahoraga in You Know Nothing About Mahoraga. But before I get to telling you about what you may or may not know, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, you guys can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. Driest train in Naruto, and boy oh boy do I wish he wasn't. Now, for those of you keen-eyed observers at home, yeah, I'm not in my studio. I'm in China. Me and my lovely fiancée Dorothy got engaged a couple of weeks ago, so we're visiting my and her family. I'm meeting my family in Japan with her to celebrate our engagement, and also just to see family. I have to vacation occasionally, but no amount of vacation is ever gonna pull me away from you, so here we are. So, Big Raga the Obstapa. How is it summoned? How do its abilities work? And can it truly adapt to any and all new stimuli it's ever introduced to? Well, let's first answer the easiest question of all. What is Mahoraga? Well, Mahoraga is a Shikigami that can be hypothetically controlled by the user of the Ten Shadows technique. Now, I say hypothetically controlled by the user of the Ten Shadows technique, A, because it's never happened outside of Sukuna, and B, because in order to control any Shikigami that falls within the purview of the Ten Shadows technique, the Ten Shadow user in question has to defeat said Shikigami. And while we never really get to see this process, either in JJK or in Majulo, basically the idea of how it works is when a Ten Shadows technique user is eventually born in the Zenin clan, and they always are born in the Zenin clan, they are born with access to the Demon Dog Shikigami, which is kind of the base set Shikigami for the Ten Shadows technique. The black and white dog that Megami had at the beginning of JJK that fused into a bigger dog after one of them died in the battle against the Special Finger Bear. Now, these demon dogs can manifest in apparently a couple of different ways. See, because while Megami, when he uses Ten Shadows technique, did just summon gigantic Shikigami dogs, we're seeing from Yuka in Majulo that she's able to manifest the abilities of these demon dogs, i.e. their fangs or their claws, to use on her own body, because she, as a member of the Zenin clan, which married into the Gojo clan because Maki and Ryuta basically kept those two clans alive, is actually forbidden from using the Ten Shadows technique because the Gojo clan doesn't want a powerful Ten Shadows user popping up again because of the history between the Gojo clan and the Zenin clan being the most powerful entities, and the Ten Shadows technique users sometimes being able to match a Six Eyes in Infinity user in strength. And thus it wasn't until Yuka was dropped into battle against Dabura and revealed that she was able to summon Mahoraga that we realized that she was a Ten Shadows user. Now, after a Ten Shadows user is born and given their demon dogs, they can then use those demon dogs to defeat the other 9 Shikigami that fall within the purview of the Ten Shadows technique. Shikigami like Round Deer, the toads with the long tongues, Nue, the flying mask owl thing, and hypothetically Mahoraga. Now, any single time that a Ten Shadows technique user summons one of the Shikigami to defeat them, they enter into a kind of death contract with that Shikigami. They and they alone are supposed to defeat that Shikigami. If anybody else joins in the fight to help that Ten Shadows user, the contract is null and void. So if hypothetically Megami summoned Round Deer for the first time and tried to use some combination of Nue, the Toads, and the Demon Dogs to defeat the Round Deer, but for some reason couldn't, and Gojo had to step in to purple away Round Deer before it could kill Megami, Megami would have to try again later to defeat Round Deer on his own because Gojo interfering stops him from controlling that Shikigami, and Mahoraga is no different. Now, like I said, this is really only a process we've ever seen with Mahoraga, most likely because Gege didn't want to take the time to show us Megami squishing a bunch of toads. But when a 10 Shadows user does summon Mahoraga to hypothetically kill Mahoraga and tame him, like with all of the Shikigami and the 10 Shadows technique, a death contract is formed. Either the 10 Shadows technique user is going to die or Mahoraga is. And sometimes both. See, because as we saw during the Shibuya incident, when Megami rather needlessly summoned Mahoraga, the first thing that Mahoraga did was kill Megami. However, because Mahoraga wasn't defeated and other people had been entered into the contract of fighting against Mahoraga, Megami's actual death was suspended. Yes, he was killed by Mahoraga, but the results of that death don't kick in until Mahoraga itself died. And thus, in a way, Megami's life was kind of put on pause. Suspended, if you shall. And we're seeing a very similar situation with Yuka right now in Majulo, because it was revealed that after Yuka summoned Mahoraga to fight against Dabura, she slipped into her own shadow, a technique that's usually associated with Megami's Chimera Shadow Garden domain expansion. However, if you know anything about Megami's domain expansion, you know slipping into the shadows not a good idea. In fact, it's a really bad one, because there's not only no buoyancy inside of Megami or any Chimera Shadow Garden shadow, and therefore those who slip into it fall into the shadow endlessly, but there's also no air inside the shadow. So if you slip into the shadow, sure, you can hold your breath for a little bit, but eventually you will die in a gigantic blackness of nothing. However, because in Majulo, Mahoraga is still fighting against Dabura, Dabura has been entered into the contract of defeating Mahoraga, so Yuka's death is suspended, at least until, hypothetically, Mahoraga or Dabura is defeated. Now, as to how Yuka, who's currently dead, is ever going to be able to get out of her own shadow, I can't really say. That's another video entirely. But the important takeaway here is that the battle against Mahoraga does not end until all combatants that have been put forth to defeat Mahoraga have been defeated. And thus, the results of the fight are not finalized until either Mahoraga or the people fighting it are put down. And since multiple people can fight against Mahoraga simultaneously, both Mahoraga and the person who summoned Mahoraga can die, like how Mahoraga was defeated when Megami summoned him and Megami died, only to be brought back to life by Sukuna, who was able to revitalize him rather easily considering the fact that Megami wasn't technically dead when Mahoraga killed him. But Nick, enough about how to summon Mahoraga. What happens when you do summon him? How do his abilities work? And has he gotten stronger over the course of both JJK and Majulo? Well, yes, he has, and I'll tell you how. See, Mahoraga's got a lot of abilities in its bag. The most well-known, of course, is its adaptation ability, but that's not even all that Mahoraga has. See, Mahoraga is obviously one of the biggest entities in the entirety of the JJK universe and is strong enough to throw entire buildings at its opponents, as has been seen with its battle against Dabura. But outside of just its physical side, strength, and speed, a thing that a lot of people forget about Mahoraga is that it has one of the strongest weapons in the entire JJK universe. See, attached to Mahoraga's right arm is a blade, and while a lot of you probably think that this 8-foot monster that's able to adapt to literally any and all kinds of attacks probably doesn't need a sword, what if I told you that sword was also basically able to nullify any and all cursed energy? See, controlling positive energy is actually a pretty big part of the 10 Shadows technique. Whether it's Roundeer's ability to simply emanate positive energy and therefore heal anybody around it, or Mahoraga's Sword of Extermination, the 10 Shadows technique is at a very high level able to tap into the power of positive energy. And positive energy, for those of you who don't remember, has two big reasons that you want to be able to use it in the JJK universe. See, not only is positive energy just kind of a different name for reverse cursed energy, because reverse cursed energy is what happens when you take the negatively charged cursed energy and times it by itself, and when you times a negative by a negative, you get a positive, and therefore positive energy is how you're able to heal yourself in the JJK universe, but also because positive energy is antithetical to negative energy. See, well, yes, a positive times a negative is a negative, and therefore it stands to reason that positive energy would actually lose in a battle against negative energy. Positive energy all the time in JJK is displayed as being able to counteract negative energy, and therefore not only can basically any and all curse techniques be nullified using positive energy, but also cursed spirits, which are made entirely out of negative energy, are incredibly weak to positive energy, and therefore Mahoraga's Sword of Extermination that's attached to its right arm is not only uniquely talented at destroying cursed techniques, but also cursed spirits, which makes sense when you consider the fact that Mahoraga is a Shikigami technically summonable by sorcerers, who, more often than not, find themselves in combat against cursed spirits. Now, unfortunately for the 10 Shadows users trying to put a leash on Mahoraga, Shikigami are also made out of cursed energy. So this blade is also incredibly effective against other Shikigamis. When it boils down to it, Mahoraga's most powerful ability / weapon is its adaptation, as Mahoraga, kind of like Doomsday in the DC universe, has the ability to adapt to any kind of stimuli. And I mean anything, whether it's fire-based attacks, physical attacks, or light-based attacks. If you hit Mahoraga with it even just once, Mahoraga will eventually be completely immune to it. However, it's not even just about defensive adaptation. See, Mahoraga adapts to everything. Not only just what you're attacking it with, but also what you're defending yourself with and how you're moving. Everything around Mahoraga, it is constantly adapting to. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions about Mahoraga out there. See, people usually just assume, let's say, hypothetically, I hit Mahoraga with a fire arrow, its wheel will begin to spin. And eventually, once its wheel has done a full rotation, fire arrows won't work on Mahoraga anymore. And well, yes, this is true. It's so much more than that. See, if you hit Mahoraga with an attack that's usually invisible, Mahoraga will adapt to being able to see that technique, but while also being able to adapt to the damage that being hit by that technique would incur. And if that attack is faster than Mahoraga would usually be able to dodge, Mahoraga will also get fast enough to dodge it. See, Mahoraga doesn't just adapt to the damage of certain stimuli. It adapts to everything about certain stimuli. It gets faster, smarter, more tactical, and it gains abilities it didn't have previously, also that can make the attack or whatever stimuli was used on it completely irrelevant down the line. So, well, yes, if I lit an arrow on fire and hit Mahoraga with it, if it pulled it out, it would start to bleed, and then maybe something like 10 minutes later, if I tried to use that same attack on Mahoraga, the arrow would simply bounce off. Mahoraga would also make its skin burn resistant, and it would become fast enough to dodge that arrow the next time. This is best displayed in Mahoraga's battle against Sukuna, where while Sukuna is battling against Mahoraga and splicing it up with as many dismantles as possible, Mahoraga begins to adapt the dismantle, not only making the slashing attack cut less deep, but also Mahoraga begins to be able to see the usually invisible attack. On top of this, we've seen Mahoraga do things like coding its Sword of Extermination, and either negative or positive cursed energy depending on who or what it's fighting. Fighting against a sorcerer, cursed energy. Fighting against a cursed spirit, positive energy. And that's what you need to wrap your mind around, about how abstract Mahoraga's adaptation actually is. Mahoraga fought against cursed spirits, and while fighting against cursed spirits, realized the best way to kill cursed spirits would be positive energy, which is why it's able to envelop its Sword of Extermination in positive energy. When Mahoraga fights against Gojo and realizes that it can't slice through his infinity, it develops a technique that it conveys to Sukuna to aim behind Gojo with its slashes, because Gojo's infinity only stops things that are aimed at him. See, because even if there is no physical, hypothetical way that Mahoraga would be able to bypass infinity, Mahoraga's adaptation is so abstract that it finds a way around infinity, which is literally to go around infinity. Mahoraga doesn't nullify infinity, it increases its intelligence to figure out the weakness of infinity. However, like any other kind of adaptation, this takes time, and not until physically coming into contact with something can Mahoraga begin to start that adaptation process. But the adaptation process does begin immediately. This is another misconception surrounding Mahoraga. See, because the second you hit Mahoraga with a stimuli, it begins to adapt. And while the first crank of its 8-cranked wheel doesn't lead to Mahoraga being completely immune to whatever stimuli you just hit it with, Mahoraga at that moment in time is 1/8 more immune to that technique than it was a second ago. And every single one of these cranks makes Mahoraga just a bit more immune to whatever stimuli was used, until eventually a full rotation of 8 cranks has occurred, and Mahoraga is completely immune for some reason or another to that stimuli. Now, if hypothetically, let's say I had one arrow that was covered in fire that I hit Mahoraga with, it would probably take Mahoraga a while to fully adapt to that technique. However, every additional time I hit Mahoraga with that technique, it speeds up its adaptation, which means there is really no added benefit to spamming a technique on Mahoraga. And in actuality, the only real way to kill Mahoraga is to hit it with your strongest attack out the gate, in hope that it's not able to heal itself from that. And if hypothetically you do this, you use a technique that Mahoraga has never seen before on it and kill it like that, well then, assuming that you're the person who summoned Mahoraga in the first place, you've tamed Mahoraga. Congratulations. Which means you get a new set of Mahoraga-based abilities, i.e. the ability to bear the burden of adaptation. See, because once a Ten Shadows user is able to tame Mahoraga, they gain the ability to place Mahoraga's wheel on their own back. So if hypothetically Mahoraga was summoned by a Ten Shadows user, and I use that same old fire arrow on Mahoraga, or even on the Ten Shadow user themselves, in either scenario, the summoner of Mahoraga would actually bear the burden of that adaptation, and therefore wear the damage. But why do this? Well, in order to ensure that Mahoraga isn't annihilated before it's able to adapt to a certain technique. Now, this isn't always your best idea, because Mahoraga, even if destroyed, can be summoned again. However, if you decide to bear the weight of adaptation of something like Gojo's purple, well then, you might die. However, if hypothetically, let's say you're, I don't know, a 1,000-year-old cursed spirit who's living inside of a 17-year-old boy's body, and that 17-year-old's body is technically the body that was able to tame Mahoraga, and you're able to live separately from that 17-year-old boy, like Sukuna was with Megumi, then you can slap the burden of adaptation on Megumi, because technically he is the summoner of Mahoraga, so that Megumi, floating inside of all of the black curses inside of Sukuna, has to bear the burden of adapting to things like Gojo's infinity. So if hypothetically Sukuna, who's in charge of his and Megumi's body at that moment in time, was hit with something like Infinite Void, Gojo's domain expansion, it would actually be Megumi who was eating the effects of that domain expansion, which scrambles your brain. And as Megumi is essentially Mahoraga now that Megumi has been hit by this domain expansion, Infinite Void, the wheel would begin to spin behind Megumi. But because it's the same wheel for everybody, this means that if that wheel was able to do a full rotation to adapt to the concept of Infinite Void, that when Mahoraga was eventually summoned, Mahoraga would take that wheel back and be completely immune to Infinite Void. Now, like I said, this is pretty much the only situation where that would ever be even remotely useful, because otherwise either Megumi or Sukuna would be eating the effects of Infinite Void in hopes that it wouldn't affect Mahoraga and Mahoraga would be able to win the fight later down the road, but they'd probably die before they'd be able to use Mahoraga. So like I said, unless you have some other person living inside of your body who hurting won't hurt you, this added benefit of taming Mahoraga doesn't really help anything. But with all of this said, and us now fully understanding how Mahoraga works, let's answer the true most important question of today's video. Is this version of Mahoraga that we're seeing in Majula right now the strongest version of Mahoraga we've ever seen? And the answer is yeah. See, because it doesn't matter who's summoning Mahoraga. Every new user of the Ten Shadows technique doesn't get a new Mahoraga, they get the same old Mahoraga. And Mahoraga had to fight in 3 key fights throughout JJK. 2 against Sukuna, 1 against Gojo. Now, over the course of these 3 key fights, Mahoraga does a lot of crazy things. It adapts to Sukuna's dismantle, making the slashing attack all but ineffective on it, which in tow most likely also makes Mahoraga completely immune to cleave, as Mahoraga doesn't only adapt to the technique that you used against it, but also all attacks of that nature. Megumi was able to bear the brunt of adaptation to Infinite Void, and therefore if a 6 Eyes and Infinite user ever wanted to use their domain expansion against Mahoraga, it wouldn't work. And in Mahoraga's final battle, at least in JJK against Gojo, while it is able to adapt to the instant speed teleportation of Gojo's blue, it is killed by Gojo's purple, in the same way that it's killed with Sukuna's Fuga the first time that he fights it. However, that brings forth an interesting question revolving around Mahoraga, which is, does Mahoraga stay adapted to any and all stimuli it's ever come into contact with, or does it have to readapt every time it's summoned, or with every new owner that it gets? And unfortunately, when it really boils down to it, we don't have an answer for either of these questions. We don't know if Mahoraga is immune to purple or Fuga, and we don't know if Mahoraga stays permanently adapted to the things that it's come into contact with, even after the 10 Shadows technique has been passed on to somebody new. See, I like to think, yes, Mahoraga's adaptations are forever, meaning whatever latest version of Mahoraga you're seeing is undoubtedly the strongest ever version of Mahoraga, which would mean that the Mahoraga we're seeing in Majula is a Mahoraga who adapted to fighting not only against Gojo, but Sukuna. And while it did lose in both of those fights, if it ever came down to it, Mahoraga had to fight against one of them again, it would probably win, because it had already fought against them and therefore had adapted to how to beat them in the first place. Which would mean Dabura is fighting against the strongest version of Mahoraga we've ever seen. Which kind of makes sense when you consider the fact that Dabura has pieced up Mahoraga with literal light-based attacks, the fastest attacks we've ever seen in the JJK universe, and Mahoraga is still just trucking along. This would also confirm that Dabura is probably the strongest opponent we've ever seen in the JJK universe, because Dabura seemingly has the leg up on Mahoraga in combat, and if Mahoraga would be able to defeat Sukuna if they fought again, well, then that by virtue would tell us that Dabura is stronger than Sukuna. However, it is important to note that Mahoraga is a familiar, summoned by the cursed energy of the 10 Shadows user in question, and therefore I guess it is a somewhat distinct possibility that every version of Mahoraga is summoned specific to the summoner who created it. But like I said earlier, unfortunately, these just aren't questions that we have answers to. So I'm gonna leave it up to you guys. Do you think that Mahoraga has to readapt every fight, or Mahoraga keeps the adaptations until the 10 Shadows technique is passed down to a new sorcerer? Do you think that this version of Mahoraga fighting against Dabura right now is the strongest ever version we've seen, or is it just run-of-the-mill Mahoraga? Let me know in the comments below. While you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, the hamburger I just ate in China's not agreeing with my stomach.